Right. We are now proceeding to our keynote talk session. We are very happy to have two of the most prominent names in international macro and finance to be acting as a keynote speaker and as a chair of the session. And so I will give the floor to Tommaso Monacelli to present Gianluca Benigno, and then we will have a 1 hour of a session. Tommaso will have to leave earlier, so at some point I will step in to connect, to record questions and to guide the discussion. Over to you, Tommaso.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander, and welcome back you all to this last section of the first day of the Lille writing workshop. So to start with, let me thank the University of Lille and the University of Reading for organizing this, and the Money, Macro and Finance Society. And of course, I'm especially pleased to introduce the keynote speaker of today, Gianluca Benigno. Gianluca, at least from my perspective, but I guess from the perspective of most of you, doesn't need much of an introduction. He's one of the pioneers of the new Keynesian open economy macro literature, as I would define it. I saw that happening from the very beginning, sort of being active in that literature myself in the early days. We know each other personally. I'm a great admirer of his work. So Gianluca has not only written a lot within the literature of monetary policy, international transmission, and optimal monetary policy in open economies. He has given contributions in the literature on liquidity traps and endogenous growth with prominent co-author Luca Fornaro. And today, he will give a general presentation on a very important problem that is sort of at the heart of a new literature linking global insights, international macro, and finance. And the title of the talk is The Global Financial Resource Curse. So this is based on recent joint work with Luca Fornaro and Martin Wolf. So it is a pleasure to have Gianluca with us today. Gianluca, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tommaso, for the kind words. And also thank you, Alex, for organizing a very interesting conference and on a very relevant topic in international macro, mainly related to reserves this morning. For me, it was morning for me. So first of all, I need to put a disclaimer on everything that I'm going to say that you can read from the slide. And this disclaimer actually is related very much to the change in the presentation, because I wanted actually to do a presentation more on the dollar, which was more in line in some ways with what the theme of the conference is about. But I had to switch to something that is also quite related, but less related to actually the dollar as such, which is what I had in mind for this conference. So this paper here that I'm going to present is the outcome of a research agenda, as Tommaso was discussing earlier on, that I started with Luca a few years ago, in which what we were trying to do is we were trying to understand the interaction between financial dimension, like of a crisis, for example, like sudden stop, and growth consequences of these episodes. So we started with a paper. It was a paper on reserve accumulation, and then we developed further our agenda along this growth component that we believe is important in order to understand both the cyclical aspect of what we observe and also structural shift. And this paper here is about a structural shift in the sense of try to understand what happens when you combine financial integration and growth in one framework. And why we want to do that? Because we want to answer to one question, which is the question that I pose here in this first slide, which is the understanding of the linkages between financial integration and global productivity growth. So in most of the work that we did, we always focused on a single economy perspective in terms of this interaction between financial integration and growth. And here instead, we move to another dimension, which is the dimension which is a global dimension. So we want to understand what happens at the level of the global economy. And the focus goes back to, in order to understand that, also we need to have a better understanding of what has happened in the US in the past 20 years or so. And the observation from which we start from are two very simple observations. The first one is an observation in terms of imbalance and the fact that external imbalance, which is directly related to financial integration and capital flows, which is the fact that the US has been a net recipient of capital flows since the late 90s. And the second observation is related to growth, and in particular to productivity growth, the fact that there's been a comparable, or in terms of timing, a slowdown in terms of productivity growth in the US. So I just want to show you a bit these two aspects that characterize, I would say, the international monetary system and capital flows, and also the real dimension of this structure. And this is the current account over GDP for United States and developing countries. And you can see that there is a gap that opens in the late 90s and becomes significant up to the global financial crisis, and then reduces because of the global financial crisis. But despite that, we see that the US in particular has been a country that has run a persistent trade deficit throughout this period. The corresponding part is, of course, a surplus, mainly from developing countries. The other aspect that I mentioned before that I want to emphasize here for this presentation is the fact that labor productivity has experienced a pattern of interest that has been of focus of a lot of research with a different angle from the one that we are proposing here, in which you see that the labor productivity, this is 5 years moving average, in the United States has been declining also in the same period in which United States have been running a significant and increasing trade deficit. For the same set of developing countries that have run a surplus in terms of current account over GDP, we see an increase in productivity in the first phase of this time period, so up to 2005, 2006, and then a decline that mirror a bit what we have seen in the United States, but with the gap that is still present in terms of productivity growth. So what do we do in this paper? Or what we want to understand in this research agenda is to try to provide a framework for interpreting these facts and link international financial integration with growth. I want to be clear here that we are not trying to explain the decline in productivity growth that has characterized actually advanced economy in general, and in particular the United States, for which there are many papers, as I said, with different angles. We want to provide a new channel or provide a new perspective on how international financial integration might affect productivity growth and also growth in the global economy, which is the focus basically of this research agenda. So here, the question or the way to think about what we are doing here is to think about a situation in which we start somehow from international imbalances, external international imbalances, and want to understand the implication of these imbalances for growth. So this is a different way in which we can think about questions related to financial integration and growth, while mainly in the literature you look at how differential growth affect capital flows. Here is the reverse. And what we do in this paper by linking international financial integration with growth is that we note that this interaction can lead to what we call global financial resource curves. And what is the global financial resource curve? So the global financial resource curve is the fact that in a way that is somehow puzzling, there are side effects or not necessarily positive effect of international financial integration, and in particular international financial integration between countries that are asymmetric in a way that I will characterize in a bit. And these asymmetries between developing countries and advanced economy, and here we are focusing on the US, might lead to a slowdown in global productivity growth and also a decline in global real interest rate. So this is the global financial resource course, because here, and there's another aspect that I want to emphasize and stress, we are just abstracting from a lot of other aspects that are important when we think about integration. We are abstracting also, for example, from trade integration. We are just focusing on financial integration. And what we want to show the perils, if you want, from a global point of view, when you think about financial integration between countries that have asymmetries, as I said earlier on. In particular, one aspect that is interesting and comes out from this analysis is that the US pays some sort of exorbitant duty, which is different from the one that Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas and Hélène Rey have characterized in their recent study of the role of the US economy in the international monetary system. They emphasize an exorbitant duty that is nominal in nature because it has to do with the different currency composition of assets and liabilities of the net international investment position of the United States. Here we are talking about a real exorbitant duty because it has to do with productivity growth. So in this sense, this integration creates a burden on the US economy in terms of slower productivity growth. So how do we do that? I'll go into more details of the model, but let me give you a little bit of a flavor of what is going on. We are proposing a two-region, two-good growth, endogenous growth model, and it's a model of technology diffusion. So there is technology that is adopted by a set of developing countries, which is one of the two regions, coming from the US economy. So the asymmetries I was discussing before are two. The first one is that the US innovation determines the world technological frontier, and the developing countries are basically absorbing knowledge from abroad. So this is the first asymmetry here, which is a plausible asymmetry up to probably very recent. The second asymmetry that is important is actually in the last point here, is that developing countries have a higher propensity to save. So in some way here, we start from the assumption that there are imbalances from an external point of view that are created by this high propensity to save by developing countries. So this is the second asymmetry. So these are the two distinctive features of this world economy that we are characterizing. On top of that, we are assuming that productivity growth is mainly concentrated in the traded sector. And we provide some discussion of this assumption. In the paper, as it currently stands, we make a radical assumption that all the productivity growth is concentrated in the traded sector, but we are doing also the extension in which productivity growth is also concentrated in or can be associated also to the non-traded sector. So there are two goods here, traded and non-traded goods. As I said before, this is a model in which we abstract from trade integration issue. So the only good that is traded is homogeneous, is one common traded good. And as I said at the beginning, this is a paper in which we focus on a structural shift. And in particular, we consider an extreme shift from financial autarky to international financial integration. And we want to understand how this shift shape eventually the adjustment or the long run in terms of this interaction between integration and growth. So the key result, and the one anticipated before, is the fact that we're going to observe a slowdown in productivity associated with this shift, so the financial integration. Why that occurs? First, as we are assuming that developing countries has a higher propensity to save, this creates capital inflows towards the US economy. So this is a byproduct of the assumptions. There's nothing particularly deep in what we do. It's just a reduced form for many studies that have discussed this aspect of the international monetary system. But the mechanism that generate the result is, we believe, more interesting, because what happens is when you have these capital inflows in the US, that generate higher consumption. And this higher consumption will shift the resources towards the non-traded sector. Why? Because higher consumption will shift, will create higher demand of traded and non-traded consumption. The demand of traded is accommodated by the deficit, which is what we observe in the data. And the demand of non-traded is accommodated by a shift of resources towards the non-traded sector. But this shift of resources towards the non-traded sector shrink the size of the traded sector and create lower scope for innovation in the traded sector that, remembers, is the engine of productivity growth. And that creates a drop in productivity growth. So that is the resource allocation channel through which capital flows create a shift towards non-traded sector and a drop in productivity growth. So this is something that we've been working with Luca in the past, and we also documented in an empirical paper across several countries with Nathan Converse and Luca as well. But the interesting aspect is that we look at the global or the general equilibrium implication of all that. And what happens here is that since the US are the leading country in terms of the technological developments, this creates a drop in productivity growth and also a drop in the world interest rate. So this is the general equilibrium effect. What is interesting is that from developing countries' point of view, of course, this integration is beneficial because they become closer to the world technological frontier. But at the same time, in the long run, they also grow at a slower pace because the pace of growth is set by the US economy that grows in a slower mode. So that is also consistent a bit with the pattern that I was emphasizing before. An aspect that is important here that also I want to stress is that this drop in the global real interest rate is of relevance because differently from a standard model of financial integration in which the world interest rate under financial integration is in between the autarky interest rates. Here, what happens is that the drop of the world interest rate is amplified by the drop in productivity, and that creates a world interest rate that goes below the autarky rates of the developing countries and the US economy. So we are in a regime of super low world interest rate that is byproduct of this interaction between capital flows and productivity growth. So this is the key result of our paper. There is a lot of very interesting literature that is very much related along different dimensions on what we do. The last bullet point emphasizes the literature on capital flows and productivity, to which we have contributed with Luca, and also we have done some empirical work, but there is a lot of very interesting work along that direction, but not looking at the general equilibrium implication of that. There is a lot of work that discusses financial integration in the macroeconomy, explaining and rationalizing these imbalances that we take as given. And also there is a lot of work that look more at the globalization side from a trade point of view, which is what we discussed here in the first bullet point. I leave it here unless there are specific questions on how we differ on with this previous contribution. But as I said, I think the unicity of our framework is to look at this interaction between growth and integration from a general equilibrium point of view, which is something, that is different from at least from our knowledge of the literature, from what has been discussed in all these papers. Now let me go more into the detail of the model. And as I said, it's a two-region economy with two goods, T for traded and N for non-traded. We simplify things as much as possible to derive analytical results that shape the intuition and the mechanism behind our findings. So on the household point of view, labor is supplied inelastically, and we have households that face a borrowing constraint, and we allow, as I said before, for different propensity to save in the two regions to capture the idea that developing countries basically finance external imbalances in the advanced economy. It's a very simple way of thinking about the world economy, the one that I want to convey here. We have a demand side that is captured by the household sector, and that is characterized in terms of the Euler equation and the consumption function. Then we have the supply side, which is the one that is described by the behavior of the firms, the traded and non-traded sector. So the non-traded sector is very simple. It's a simple linear production function environment with variable labor input. The traded sector is a little bit more articulated, as borrows from the endogenous growth literature and characterized model of innovation. So there's nothing new except borrowing from the literature. And on top of that, we create the international channel of innovation by allowing for technological adoption. So in developing countries, firms that produce the intermediate goods, the level at which innovation occurs, improve the quality of their goods by adopting technological advances from the US economy. So that's the asymmetry that I mentioned before. So that's a structure. As I said, there is a consumption aggregate demand block that will depend critically on financial integration. So if you're an autarky, you basically consume what you produce. If you are in a financial integration regime, then you borrow up to the limit for the US economy in order to exploit the flows that comes from the rest of the world because of the different propensity to save. There is a supply side point of view, which is the one that comes from the optimizing behavior of the firm and how much they want to innovate. And that basically determine how much you grow from a US point of view and how much closer you are to the frontier from the developing country point of view. And then lastly, but not less important, there is also the dimension of how you allocate your resources among the three sectors. Here, you have a very simple framework in which the key variable input in terms of resources allocation across sectors is labor. So here we need to choose if labor goes to the innovation sector, goes to the non-tradable sector, or to the traded sector. So that's the allocation resources dimension. So this is the characterization of the economy. I just present a few details here. The preference specification is standard. The budget constraint is standard. This tau T here is simply the way in which we characterize the asymmetry in terms of saving behavior. So in the developing countries, government subsidize investment in bonds. So that's how we tilt the propensity to save and make those economies basically financing the imbalance in the United States. As I said, there is a lot of literature that discuss why that might happen. It might be due to reserve accumulation purposes, it might be due to financial integration caused by difference in financial development across countries. But we take basically this as given. And then this is the borrowing constraint, which will limit the amount that we can borrow externally from a country point of view. And this is a device that allows us to solve the model neatly and analytically to get the intuition behind the result. On the firm side, non-traded sector is super simple. The traded sector, let me just briefly discuss. This A here is basically improvement in quality. This is a very standard production function from endogenous growth literature, in which X is the intermediate input, and the quality associated with each input that is employed for the production of traded good depends on the quality of the input, and the quality of the input can be improved upon innovation that occur at the intermediate goods sector. What is important here when it comes to innovation is that the incentive to innovate depend on rents, on what you get out of it. In the intermediate goods sector, there is monopolistic competition, and the profits that you get are a function of, critically, of this LT, which is the size and of the traded sector, basically. Okay, so the bigger is the size of the traded sector, the higher are the incentive to innovate. Now, let me give you a bit of background, as you can see, of our assumptions. So first of all is the fact that in the US, a lot of R&D is basically done by the manufacturing sector as opposed to the service sector. And this is despite the fact that the manufacturing sector is a shrinking size of the US economy. And secondly, here we can see also the fact that a lot of productivity growth has been, especially in the first part of this sample we are looking at, has been concentrated, or higher productivity growth is concentrated in the manufacturing sector as opposed to the business sector, again, for the US economy. So how is the innovation process shaped? And again, here we borrow from John Howitt in allowing for the quality, and U stands here for United States, in the next period to depend on how much resources here you devote to innovation at the period before. And the resources here are denoted by LU here. So this is the amount of labor that is allocated to the innovation activity. And as I said before, at the level of the intermediate goods, this incentive to innovate depends on the profits that you get out of the innovation activity that are proportional to the size of the traded sector. And the maximization problem basically deliver the growth equation that determines the growth rate of the US economy as a function of the size of the traded sector. So the bigger is the traded sector, the higher is the growth rate in the US economy. So that's the key equation from the supply side in the US economy. There is something very similar that happens at the developing country level. But the developing country level, as I said, is a little difference here in terms of the growth process. And the reason which is difference is because they adopt technology from the US economy. And the adoption of technology is captured by this term here that enters the law of motion of quality in intermediate goods in the developing economy. So this fee is the extent to which developing countries benefit from US stock of knowledge. And the C capture the productivity of research in developing countries. So these are key parameters for the analytical results and detail, but basically here we are restricting this diffusion of technology to the traded sector, in line also with the study that Roderick did in his QJE 2012 paper. The difference from developing country point of view is that the innovation choice gives rise to an equation here, which is similar to the growth equation before, but rather than determining the growth rate, determines the proximity to the technological frontier, which is captured by this variable A, which is a ratio of developing over US economy technological level. Still, this economy in the balanced growth path growth at the rate G. So the rate G is set by the US economy. The proximity to the frontier is set by the developing countries. Now, we then have the consumption and demand side. This is easy because under autarky, we just consume what we produce. This is the expression that we get. Under financial integration, what happens is that the US households borrow up to the limit because of the difference in propensity to save. And the interest rate is going to be determined, which is going to be there's going to be a unique interest rate because of financial integration. But the interest rate is going to be determined by the Euler equation in developing countries. And the Euler equation in developing countries has this tilting factor given by tau here. And this is the consumption function in the US economy. So basically, we have a model in which there is a growth side, supply side, a demand side, and a resource allocation side. The demand side split basically depending on financial autarky versus financial integration. Then we have the resource allocation side, in which what we need to do here is determine how total labor, which is inelastically supplied, is divided among the three sectors: tradable, non-tradable, and resources and innovation. So this is the traded one. The second component here comes from intertemporal condition that determines non-tradable sector and consumption of non-tradable goods. And the third one here is the amount of labor that is used in the innovation sector. So this is similar for advanced and developing bloc, of course, corrected by the fact that there you have the distance to the frontier as another variable that determines how much you're going to use of labor in that innovation sector. But conceptually, the two are the same because basically what we have a negative relationship between labor in the traded sector and the growth rate of the economy or the proximity to the frontier here in steady state. So I'm going to do a very simple characterization of the economy, in which what we are going to do is that we are going to look basically at the combination of this system of equation, in which what we have the growth side, the resource allocation side, and the demand side. And we do that graphically in a way that makes hopefully our analysis very clear and transparent by combining the growth rate and the resource allocation in one very simple graph and move this line depending on the regime in which we are in. It's a regime of financial autarky, so this consumption is going to be different, or it's a regime of financial integration, in which consumption is going to be higher due to the fact that the US economy borrow up to the limit. And similarly, we have something similar also for developing countries. So let me show you how we do that graphically. This is a simple representation of the steady state analysis, so the analysis of balanced growth path, in which we combine these two equilibrium conditions, basically, from a resource allocation point of view and the growth allocation and the growth supply side point of view for both United States and developing countries. So what we see here, this you can think about this as the autarky equilibrium, in which what we do is that we're going to determine how much labor we are going to allocate in each tradable sector for these two countries, the growth rate of the world economy, sorry, of the economy, US economy here, and the proximity to the frontier of the developing countries block. So what happens next? I mean, here, let me first say a few words about financial autarky, which we can represent with this graph. And the financial autarky, as I said before, we just consume what we produce, and we are in a regime in which there is segmented interest rate because there's no financial integration. There's no other dimension of integration except the technological diffusion here, but interest rates are going to be determined by Euler equation in each country. And we're going to have two different interest rates because we have a different tau here for developing countries, but there's no integration, no trade integration, no financial integration. Then we move
Gianluca,
yes.
just to say that you have about 10, 12, max 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, I can be within 10 minutes actually.
No worry, just so
fine.
That you know how is
Okay.
the timing. Thanks.
Yeah, I was speeding up because I was looking at the time. Thank you for reminding. Under financial integration, what happens is the first thing is that real interest rates are going to be equalized across the two regions. And since there is a higher propensity to save in developing countries, what happens is that the US economy hits the borrowing limit. So in equilibrium here, or under our first characterization of equilibrium, the US economy is running a permanent trade deficit. And we do that because we are focusing on a case, a parametric case in which beta multiplied by 1 plus tau is greater than 1, so that the world interest rate is lower than the growth rate of the economy. So this condition here guarantee that we are in a world, a steady state, in which the US economy is running a permanent trade deficit. Under financial integration, what happens, the mechanism is the same as the one I was highlighting a bit before. Trade deficit implies high consumption of traded and untraded goods. High consumption of traded goods increase or is supported by the deficit, but increase also the demand of non-traded goods that generate allocation of resources toward the non-traded sector, that shrink the traded sector, and also reduce the incentive to innovate. And this is what causes a decline in productivity. Graphically, this is what we observe. We observe a shift of the resource allocation line in the US economy to the left, and this shift is the one that is driven by the fact that now we consume more. And as we consume more of traded goods, we also consume more of non-traded goods, and that creates this shift to the left, so that we also have in equilibrium low or lower resources allocated in the traded sector. And this is what drives lower productivity growth in the new equilibrium. So this is the new equilibrium caused by an increase in consumption in the traded sector. So this is how this curve shifts. In the other economy, in the other block here, the other region, in developing countries, what we see the opposite shift, because their consumption of traded sector is going to be lower because of the current account surplus. And also what we see a shift of the GG line, because the growth and supply line depend also on productivity growth in the United States, and that drops. And that's what creates the shift upward of the supply curve in developing countries. So we end up in an equilibrium here in which we have higher employment in the tradable sector, and also a bigger proximity to the frontier. So that's the impact of financial integration. So it looks good in some ways for the developing countries, but it's not that good, because you need to think about the fact that these countries are closer to the frontier, but at the same time grow at a slower pace, because the growth rate of the world economy is set by GF, which is the growth rate of the US economy under financial integration. Now, this is something already mentioned. One aspect that I want to emphasize, which I mentioned at the beginning, but I think it's interesting and it's important here, is that this world interest rate that arise from integration is going to be lower than both autarky interest rates for developing and advanced economy. And is lower because of this amplification effect coming from the drop in productivity. So the drop in productivity make a super low world interest rates. So that's also an interesting byproduct analysis of our framework. So what is the global financial resource curse? To summarize here a bit, is the situation in which integration lead from a global point of view to a regime of low productivity and low real interest rate. As I said before, this integration leads to an exorbitant duty, which is real in nature because it has to do with productivity growth. It's not something that has to do with currency composition of the net international investment position, but is also something that comes from the special role and this asymmetry that I was emphasizing before of the US being the center of international monetary system that we can capture here as we are modeling the US as an attraction point in terms of capital inflows, but also the lead technological leader. And this exorbitant duty from the US point of view is also global implication because it implies a slower growth pace for the US economy. Now, let me, how much time do I have? Because I can say something on the transition and maybe conclude again, but Alex, you want to?
7-8 minutes.
Okay, so I have more than what I thought. So in the transition, so this analysis that I provided is an analysis that focus on the steady state. So the graphical analysis and analysis that look at what happens in the steady state, but it's also interesting to study what occur in the transition. And here we do a very simple way in which capture the transition by changing basically slowly the degree of integration over time to reach what we would achieve in steady state, and study how the economy would adjust during this transition period. And why this is interesting, because what we want to show is also this tension in terms of how productivity growth changes from the perspective of developing countries in the transition phase as opposed to the long run. And what is interesting here is, as you can see here, for example, when you look at the transition and this red dashed line is the developing country, is that you see that the following integration, which is what occurred in period one here. And so it's a very, I want to say this is a mainly illustrative and not quantitative exercise. And the model is, as you could tell, is a very simple model that tries to capture more the intuition and the forces that might shape what we observe rather than quantifying them. Is that in the transition, there is an increase in productivity growth for the developing countries. And eventually, as you can see, productivity growth reaches the level of balanced growth path, which is set by the US economy, which drops because of the mechanism that I emphasized. So you see the monotonicity in productivity growth of developing countries. So this is an aspect that I think it's worth emphasizing also to understand what we observe, I mean, or to have a possible explanation of what we observe. So this is, I think, an interesting aspect of the transition, this tension from the developing country point of view between the short run, in which you see a boom in productivity growth, and the long run, in which you pay, if you want, the consequences in terms of the integration and the exorbitant duty that has global implication from the United States point of view. So this is a case that we discuss in the paper, in which, on the other hand, we focus on a different kind of equilibrium in the steady state, which is an equilibrium in which in steady state, the interest rate is above the growth rate, so that in steady state, there's no longer a permanent rate deficit from the United States point of view, and you can see it here from this graph here. But still, despite that, the global financial resource curse, so this mechanism that I described before, still exists and can be long-lasting, because as you can see here, it's something that affects the US economy in the transition, not in the long run, but is still present because the same forces that I described before are still playing a role now in the transition as opposed to the long run, depending on how we want to think about the long run. Here we took a stance in the long run, which is consistent in terms of the data that we look at the data in terms of very low interest rate relatively to growth rate, and this has been something that we have seen for the past at least 10, 15 years. But of course, we might allow also for something different in which the interest rates are above the growth rate, and that will lead still to the same forces to operate in the transition, but still they can be long-lasting as well. In the paper, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview before concluding. We do discuss several extensions and we do several exercises. We look at exercises aimed at discussing some policy analysis. We don't do optimal policy analysis, so we just shift parameters to see what happens. For example, one exercise we do is to change tau to capture the idea of export-led growth strategy in developing countries. Another exercise we do is an exercise in which we impose capital control in the United States. Another exercise we do is an exercise in which we discuss policy of innovation in the United States. So we do several policy exercises to try to discuss current or past policy debates and see how the model could, shed light on the implication of some of these policy choices. In the particular case here of the export-led growth strategy, which is something I think Alex was discussing when he was talking about the Eisman and Lee paper in the reserve accumulation, which here, of course, we are not modeling, but we capture in a rough way implicitly by this tau here, is that most of the time when we think about that kind of reserve strategy and export-led growth strategy, we think that in terms of a perspective in which we do not take into account of what can be the global repercussion of it. And here, to the extent to which the developing bloc behave in such a manner, it might end up in what we call here coordination trap. So the idea that this growth strategy is pursued independently, but in a similar way by a set of countries, can lead to this mechanism and eventually penalize the country that individually choose this type of behavior. So I think it's a very interesting framework. I hope I convinced you that's a very interesting framework. This one, or more generally, I think it's in a research agenda that I think it's promising because we started actually look at thinking about growth when we were thinking about sudden stop. We shaped further our thinking when we thought about the debate on secular stagnation. And here we're going back again to capital flows, but looking at this with Martin also from a global point of view. I think, thinking in terms of growth is relevant, especially, in the post-global financial crisis world in which growth consideration dominated the policy debate. But surprisingly, I would say most of the time this growth literature is developed independently from other branches of macroeconomics. So the work behind this research agenda is to try to think in an integrated way between growth and other aspects. Here we are thinking about financial integration. In the other work, we thought in terms of a cyclical fluctuation associated with nominal rigidity. And I think there is a lot, hopefully, of research that can be done along these lines that combine these elements to shed lights on what we observe in the real world. So I want to thank again for your attention, because here, in case there are questions, and I hope hopefully convey the main message behind this research agenda and the paper I try to present. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Gianluca, for an insightful keynote talk. We learned from it that there is not just national real resource curves, but also there is now global financial resource curves. Very interesting stuff. Financial integration leads to productivity slowdown and low interest rates. I now open the floor for questions, and I invite the colleagues. I assume that, yeah, they have raised hands and they have switched on their cameras. So in the order that this happened, I am giving the floor first to Etienne and then to Gülçin, and finally to Michael. Etienne.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Gianluca, for a very clear presentation. And in fact, when I was listening and I was thinking about the fact that you were telling a story of something we were calling in Europe the Dutch disease. And I was wondering if the Dutch disease was stronger for financial integration or for being the innovation leader. Because of course, then the implications in terms of policy lessons are very different. So I was wondering if you have an insight about the relative strength, I would say, of the two effects.
Maybe you can respond to Etienne, or shall we collect? Let's respond question by question. We have about 10 minutes, but I can extend 5 minutes if there are interesting issues to discuss. Over to you, Gianluca.
No, thanks, Etienne, for the question. It is true indeed that I mean, in general, what we do is very much related to the Dutch disease issue in terms of the natural resource curves. No, it is very much related to that. Here is slightly different from that. It is inspired by it, that literature, because we actually emphasize a lot the financial dimension, to answer your question, of these curves. And this financial dimension operates through the resource allocation. So it's mainly financial, I would say. I think from a policy point of view, what is important, if you think about external imbalances, is the source of the imbalance. And that is what matters at time for understanding the extent to which you might have this misallocation of resources that might lead to stagnant productivity. And that is the issue. I think in Europe, if I infer from your question, you're focusing about the episode of capital inflows that have been pronounced in the pre-global financial crisis period. And those capital inflows, in my study with Luca, been mainly led by a decline in interest rates that have spurred capital inflows, especially towards periphery of Europe. And that had created some misallocation of resources. And to the extent to which that is not beneficial, of course, that might demand policy intervention or proper policy intervention.
Thank you, Gianluca. Over to you, Gülçin.
Thank you, Alex. This is really interesting, Gianluca. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering whether we can think of another kind of transition or another possible equilibrium. Suppose that there is a case where the excess saving in the developing country stops moving into US, but starts moving into the innovation sector in the developing country. Would we think of a possibility where that would reverse their relative position regarding the technology frontier, which might in turn reverse this obviously unfavorable downturn in global growth rates?
Yes, I forgot to mention. Thanks for the question, Gülçin. I think it's a relevant question, and it's actually more relevant as we progress in time, because we see no more necessary of a catching up, but we see also developing countries, more notable China, becoming leader in some sectors. So how does that square with our mechanism, and to the extent to which, as you said, there is this possibility, how does that affect? We are discussing this actually briefly in the, I think, the appendix of the paper, in which we allow for leapfrogging. Basically, the possibility that depending on where you are in terms of technological frontier, the incentive shift from one country to, or actually the being technological leader might shift from one country to another. And of course, that creates a different and richer implication in terms of these no longer maybe global financial resource cores, or the possibility of the extent to which there is, again, something very similar. But we allow for this possibility, and we discuss this aspect also in the paper. So it's a very, very important aspect. But as I said, it's another dimension along which, I mean, there is a lot you can do with this. I think with respect to that, I think also something very interesting. There are many other things that might be interesting, because that we take as granted, because we might want to think also to the extent to which this type of shift might also shift the center of the international monetary system. So now, not only just affecting the fact that the US is the technological leader, but also affect the extent to which the US is, or the dollar is, the key currency. So to the extent to which this factor might endogenously also lead to that. That is also something else that may be worth thinking of in terms of, of course, articulated version of this framework. But yes, it is something we allow and we discuss in the paper.
Very interesting.
I assume Michał has a question.
Yes, thank you. I have actually two questions, maybe comments. So one is related to the original Dutch disease. It was also very much about labor moving into the sector that discovered these new resources. Here, your new resource is actually finance, right? So the financial integration leads to a boom in the financial sector in the US, but you don't really model the financial sector explicitly, as far as I understand. So I guess this could be a mechanism to amplify your effects if the US financial sector actually was also increasing its share in employment and diverting workers from the tradable sector. And I think to some extent this is in line with the data, where the US financial sector was attracting a lot of physics and engineering graduates that would normally work in the R&D sector of manufacturing in the US. And the other question or comment goes in the opposite direction. So here, R&D does not really require capital, which means that the capital inflow from the developing country is irrelevant in a direct way for R&D. If R&D was more capital intensive as well, actually the extra inflow of capital and the fall in interest rates could push growth up, right? Making capital more available to the tradable sector.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks. Very, very important questions, both. So the first one, what do we do here? You're right. So think about, we don't have a financial sector. I don't think that actually matters too much. And let me tell you a bit why. I mean, you correctly pointed out it's very similar to the natural resource course. And it's basically the way we do that, especially if you look at the comparative study exercise in the long run, it's like having a windfall. That's what capital flows is. It's having a windfall that allows you to consume more from a US point of view. So in that sense, that's what we do. and it's very crude, simple. I don't think that matters too much in terms of financial, because we really want to capture the integration aspect, and we do in that very simple way. But yes, I mean, if you think about the financial sector as a sector, I mean, that is a relatively low productivity sector, and maybe, resources might go into that sector and be going to be a little bit finer in that dimension. That could be a mechanism that could, if anything, amplify what we are having. The second question is, I think it's very interesting as well. So what happens there? Let me clarify a couple of things. And you're right. So the resources, for simplicity, what we are doing there is that we are just basically allocating labor across sectors. So there's no other way in which we can support R&D or innovation. What is crucial, though, is the size of the tradable sector. Now, probably, this I don't know for sure, but to the extent to which there are other factors that we include in the R&D, what is still going to matter is to the extent to which the incentive to innovate depends on the size of the sector in which dynamic productivity gain are generated. So I suspect that, things are going to be similar in terms of the principle, but the details might be more interesting as well, because of course you add another dimension there of analysis. Still, keep in mind that, there are these two effects that are still playing a role there. One effect is the size, the market size effect, which is the typical effect in the endogenous growth literature, which is confined to the size of the traded sector, which is what I'm emphasizing here. And the second effect that is important here is still present, the fact that there is lower interest rate because of financial integration. And that, in principle, can spur investment in the R&D sector. But, the market effect is the one that matters or dominates. So the effects on the interest rate is still there. The form through which it operates is very simple, as you correctly pointed out. I suspect that even if we enrich a bit the model to the extent to which the principle is associated with the size of the traded sector, things will be very similar. But yes, thanks.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you, Gianluca. Any more questions, colleagues? I know we are 3 minutes late, but it's worth, if there is another question, we can stay for another 3 minutes. If not, I want to thank to the keynote speaker and to all of you attending today. I think we started the workshop in a good fashion, and I want to remind you that tomorrow we have another second day starting at 10. 10 is UK time, Greenwich Mean Time. Sorry, I confused a few colleagues by not being explicit in the program that what I meant is UK timings of the slots. So we'll have a full day tomorrow starting from 10 o'clock with many other interesting talks in 2 allocated sessions. I have to apologize, and I really regret, when we go to these workshops lives, now it is the dinner, and we can go to a dinner and discuss and interact again. Hopefully next year, if we do it in Lille in a normal situation, we will not be deprived of this good part of our traditional workshops. Thank you all again. I'm now going to stop the recording, and I invite you tomorrow to the other sessions in the program. Thanks again. Have a good evening in the UK.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
Have a good afternoon in the US. Bye.